Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm here live with Dean Weingarten, our last guest for the evening. Dean is, he's a man of many talents, but he is mostly a
I'm
writer.
old. Lots of experience.
Well, I'll give you that as well. But you one of the things that you do is you write. You're a regular contributor to AmmoLand, Shooting Sports News. And I came across an article that you'd written relatively recently. It looks like it was published April 1st, 2025. And the article is called "Without Privacy, the Second Amendment Fails." And I was intrigued by the title because I think that privacy is something that's often overlooked, especially in conservative circles, let me put it that way, but also in not just conservative circles, but I say that in contrast because we're here at the NRA annual meeting, and of course, many of the attendees, it's a diverse group. Many of the attendees, though, are conservative-minded folks. And I think that privacy also falls under the radar in both political camps, but I think it's something that a lot of gun supporters don't realize is incredibly important to the right to keep and bear arms.
Well, it is because effectively we live in this information age, and governments throughout history have tried to disarm the population to keep control over them. And it's a fairly recent development in the last couple thousand years that we've decided, and particularly within the Glorious Revolution in England and then with us, that subjects should be allowed to have arms. Or they have a right to arms because they have a right to overthrow a tyrannical government. Now, that's never been really espoused. It's sort of assumed that if you succeed, you're good. But if you don't, you're dead or exiled or something, run away. But we had this combination, I would call it Christian capitalism, where a combination of freedom, respect for the truth in religion, combined together with the Reformation and the Renaissance, to where, especially with the printing press making information more available to everybody, these ideas circulated that man should be treated with respect. Now, you have that as part of Christian heritage generally. Men are equal under God. Although there's a little bit of a tradition that governments are a little more equal than others, but men are should be treated with some respect. The brotherhood of man, essentially, that just because that all people, probably the biggest equalizer in Christianity is everybody's a sinner, and so we're all need forgiveness from God, and that translated into everybody is created equal by God, and therefore we should have equal rights under God. And so there came this idea with the Renaissance that governments have they have to treat people well. They have a necessity. They're required to do it. It's not something that you just wish they would do. They should do. And so part of that was, if a government is acting really badly, you can overthrow it. And of course, everybody from antiquity on said you have a right to defend yourself. But the right to defend yourself from your own government, pretty recent. And that's where the Second Amendment comes from. Well, if you have no privacy, if the government knows where all the arms are, it pretty nullifies the right to be able to protect yourself, because that knowledge translates into the ability to disarm you, whether individually, piece by piece. Well, this guy's a bad guy, we're going to disarm him. And in this information age, not only do we know where he lives, but we know where he shops, and we know what he eats, and who his friends are, and what the telephone numbers are. Our society has developed safeguards in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights so that it's harder for our government to just kill people off. I'm I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I believe it happens. You know, I won't talk documented cases, but people are people. And if somebody is particularly troublesome and they can't find any legal way to get rid of them, I think it probably happens now and then that, you know, somebody's assassinated, they're disposed of it. But it's harder in our society. You know, we don't have the defenestration, thrown out of windows problem that Russia seems to have. In China, they don't worry about it. They just pick you up, you disappear, you go into a concentration camp, whatever. You know, you might get let out if you're emphatically claiming that you really didn't mean what you said or whatever, and you'll abide by the regime's results. But here we have the Fourth Amendment, we have the First Amendment, we have all these protections. And so if the government doesn't officially know who has what gun where, it's harder to confiscate them. And we see that because we have states where they confiscated guns already. California has an ongoing program. They are trying to get every gun in California that is legal registered. In other words, if it's not registered, it's not legal. And the opposition that wants more and more power in the hands of the government, they want that for the whole United States. But in the United States, we have at least a law until now, I mean, still going, under the Trump administration, I believe it'll be honored, that it's illegal to have a registration list for the whole U.S. And there's only very few states that require registration of all their guns. So we can stop the confiscation, or at least we have a pretty good safeguard against confiscation if they don't officially know where the guns are. Now, personally, I'd love to see the requirement for serialization taken away from the government and the ATF, because the whole purpose of putting serial numbers on guns, the political purpose of putting serial numbers on gun, is to be able to register them.
Yeah, to track the guns in some way, right?
Yeah. I mean, they used to ask for a model, a make, any distinguishing characteristics. It's an imperfect system. It didn't work very well. But then in 68, they required that all guns have serial numbers. Before that, in 38, they said you can't take a serial number off, or it's a crime to do so. It's a crime to possess a gun that has a serial number that's been taken off of it. But it wasn't illegal to have a gun that never had a serial number in the first place. And they're really pushing hard to try to get this concept of serialization of all guns onto homemade guns. California's passed a law, I think Massachusetts, there may be another. They say, well, you can make a gun, that's okay. But you have to inform us, you have to get a serial number given by us, we have to see the serial number on the gun so that we can make sure that we have the ability to track and trace it and determine whether it's legitimately owned as determined by us.
The so-called ghost gun.
Well, yes,
situation,
exactly.
Right?
And
as if somehow a firearm that doesn't have a serial number is evil in itself.
Well,
right?
They use this, I think it's a ludicrous argument that somehow having a serial number on a gun makes it less dangerous. I mean, it's crazy.
What about
doesn't
this?
work?
I'll interject. And first of all, I agree with you totally, but I'll take the government position here. You know, we're inundated by propaganda in the foreign policy. One of the terms is national security. Another one is public safety. And this somehow helps us, serial numbers, it helps law enforcement track down the bad guys. And unless you intend to use the firearm for nefarious purposes, why do you care, aside from your arguments about privacy? Why do you care if your firearm is serialized? Those are the things that the government wants us to
the major differentiation between what I would call conservatives, and it's not absolute, but a major differentiation is that conservatives believe in human nature and they don't trust the government because the government's made up of humans and humans are fallible and there's a lust for power. And so we believe that the government could easily be taken over by the wrong people. In fact, we just had 4 years of that, I would say.
And other countries have experienced that.
Absolutely.
Or Germany, for instance.
Well, or
maybe a favorable government before.
Exactly. You should treat this as a worst case scenario. If the wrong people take over, do you want them to have a list of all the people who have guns? Not just a list of all the people who have guns, but a list of the particular guns they have by serial number. And so you go to their house. I mean, if they're bad guys and you don't like their politics, if you're a bad government, and say, give us these guns. And in some cases, not all in occupied Europe, if you didn't produce the gun, they just kill you on the spot. Now, there were lots of exceptions to that. But you don't want that situation. And so essentially, once the guns are registered, they are confiscated. It's just a matter of when, or when the government decides to take them. And they can take them. And people say, well, they won't go door to door. Well, they're going door to door in California right now. Some psychiatrist says that they have a report that you made a threat, and suddenly you're on a list that you're not eligible to have guns anymore in California.
Well, we saw an example of this, not just in California, but with the pistol stabilizing brace situation, yes. Right? With federal agents going around and knocking on doors to find people who had supposedly purchased these sorts of items.
Because they had used the serial numbers to find to follow the trail to where the firearm ended up.
And you see, if you have the list of the people and you have the list of the guns that they have, you don't have to send people door to door. You just say, report to this police station with these guns at this time, or you're found in contempt of court. That will follow with, confiscation proceedings against your house, or just turning off your power, or turning off your water supply, or voiding your driver's license, voiding your car license. We live in this administrative state in a digital world, and all of that information is available to the state, so that if the state says you officially have this gun and we don't want you to have it, they have multiple ways to reach out for you other than sending a SWAT team to your house.
To include influence on private organizations.
Absolutely.
Like banks.
Sure, look at this has happened. We've seen this with debanking and by prominent people. I mean, if they can do what they did with lawfare to former President Trump, who's the most prominent candidate running against them, I mean, this is really third world dictatorship stuff. And they didn't succeed, but they tried it. If they're willing to do that to him, you know that they would be super willing to do it to an ordinary person who doesn't have the resources to fight back.
Yeah.
So privacy is very important. Now, as to this claim that having serial numbers on guns somehow is used by the police to reduce crime, it's ludicrous. It doesn't hold up. Even under full registration systems like Canada has registered pistols since about 1930, 32, 34, around in there. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were asked to present instances where the registration was used to solve a violent crime. Not just, we want to take this person's guns for whatever, or we found this gun, who does it belong to? It was stolen, something like that. And they came up, I think, with one instance in 50 years. You know how many millions of dollars were spent on that system? Tens of millions of dollars to get one help in one conviction. And Michigan had the same situation. They had a requirement that pistols be registered in the state. It was 30, 40 years. When they were queried about this, how many crimes was it used to solve? And we're not talking about a gun was stolen crime, but a violent crime was committed. You found the gun, you used the gun trace system to somehow connect with the criminal. They had one possible case. And when in 86, this was being debated in Congress. Maybe it was a little earlier. I only read the article recently. The U.S. government claimed that they had used a trace gun a couple of times to solve a violent crime. Yeah. But look at the cost. You have to look at the cost to benefit ratio. If you spend those tens, and with the federal government, we're talking probably hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to maintain the system, to keep it up, to input the data, to check it.
And it's not just the registration cost, the enforcement cost. It's the
absolutely.
cost to individual liberty, right?
Absolutely.
These people are deprived of the right to keep and bear arms and that right to self-defense.
Absolutely. And so you've all these costs and you don't get hardly any benefit. Yeah. I mean, it's all a charade. It's an excuse. The idea that it's fighting crime is just an excuse, in my opinion, to build a case for putting a registration system in place.
And it's ultimately about control.
Oh, of course. Absolutely.
Yeah, ultimately about
perhaps another characterization is propaganda.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I like the way you lay out the strategy here in your article. You say the most successful playbook in eliminating the right to own weapons in functioning democracies is to follow this strategy. And the strategy has been this: claim governments can control crime by controlling who has access to weapons. Right. Which is just bizarre, like we've been talking about, right? Claim to control access to weapons, governments have to know who has weapons.
Exactly.
Right? Require registration of all legal weapons. Any weapons which are not registered are declared illegal. Part of the problem that we haven't talked about with that is that criminals are not going to comply with this.
It doesn't affect criminals hardly at all.
Right.
It really has almost no effect on crime. The people who buy into this propaganda are generally people who trust the government. And as I said, we're kind of bifurcated into a society now. People who trust the government and people who don't trust the government. And a lot of the people who want people to trust the government, they don't really want anybody else to be in power. They only trust the government if their group is in power.
Yeah.
And a whole bunch of our checks and balances, many of our checks and balances in the Constitution are designed so that we can have a peaceful transfer of power, so that the group that's on the outs doesn't have to worry about having their home raided, being thrown in prison, being executed, having to run for their safety to another country, having all their assets confiscated. That creates a horrible drag on society. This level of fear becomes endemic, and nobody is willing to accumulate much wealth unless they have a lot of political power or pull. All that's terrible for society, and so we created a system where we can transfer power peacefully through the ballot box, and people can trust the result, at least up until the last couple of elections. I mean, I tend to think that Trump won this last election simply because it was too big to cheat.
Yeah, I think that's a great deal of it. But it really goes back even slightly further, maybe not to the same, certainly not to the same degree. There was the whole hanging Chad thing
absolutely.
in the Bush Gore.
There's always been some cheating.
Yeah, right.
There's always. It's a degree.
Yeah.
And I think there is a rural versus urban split on this too.
Mm-hmm.
That you just don't seem to have as much capacity to cheat in the rural areas. The vote totals are small. The people know what's going on more. They know the people individually. There's not as much anonymity.
The cheating is of less consequence because, by definition, it's less populated in a rural area.
Well, that's true, too.
Yeah.
But in big urban centers where you have a lot of anonymous people and you have huge numbers and you have automated voting machines that are not well vetted, I mean, and you try to go to, or you force going to mail-in ballots for everybody, the potential for cheating just keeps growing and growing geometrically.
Yeah. And so we talk about the first few steps here to this strategy. The third of which was require registration of all legal weapons. And obviously criminals, as we said, are never going to comply with these sorts of registration schemes. But then slowly or abruptly, such as during an emergency, right, confiscate weapons using the government registration list.
It's a favorite tactic, this emergency thing. I mean, you can declare an emergency for almost anything. And conservatives have railed against that law passed by Congress and saying, look, you guys won't like it when it's used against you. Well, now President Trump, and I think with some justification, declares an emergency because of the immigration issue at the border. Suddenly, that's not legitimate. That's not what the law was meant for. We're only supposed to be the ones who can declare an emergency, not the other side.
That's right.
It's crazy. And under the emergency, you get all kinds of extra powers. And we've seen it around the world again and again. My favorite example is over in the Philippines under Marcos, I believe, that I had an acquaintance who emigrated to the U.S. from the Philippines, and he talked about his family. And there was that decree that went out, and I forget the date, a couple of decades ago, that all the registered guns had to be turned in because it was an emergency. And we'll give them back to you eventually. And eventually a few were returned, but most weren't. And his family had some guns that weren't registered, and they buried them. But the problem was then they forgot where they buried them, and they couldn't find them. And I was involved in military testing of burying weapons to retrieve them later. It does not work very well, unfortunately. I mean, it'd be nice if it did, but it just doesn't. Burying them under the ground seems one of the worst ways to store weapons, to retrieve them later. We found that in Panama, anyway, you were better sticking them up in a tree somewhere.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
There's some good news in that area, though. At the state level, since Katrina and what happened in New Orleans,
yes,
there's been some state statutes passed in at least several, I'll characterize it as several states. Florida, for instance, that says essentially, hey, listen, during an emergency, like a hurricane, that's when you need your firearms most, and the government's prohibited from declaring an emergency to the extent that they can confiscate or restrict the use of firearms.
Yes, absolutely. I remember back in the 1980s, early 1980s, I learned that as part of FEMA protocol, anybody who was entering a fallout shelter was to be disarmed. You weren't allowed to bring weapons into a fallout shelter. And I thought, this is utterly crazy. This is the most stupid thing. That has since been rescinded, I understand. And we've seen this trend, very positive trend, that states passing specific statutes saying you are not allowed to confiscate guns from citizens during an emergency. And so the social winds, as it were, seem to be at our back at the moment. And we need to make as much hay, to mix a metaphor.
Yeah, that's right. While the sun is shining, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the final stage here in this strategy that you've identified, I think is interesting. Gradually teach future generations that having weapons is bad.
It is. It's in some places it's worked. I would say
Europe comes to mind.
Yeah, England particularly. Yeah. I've done a couple of stories where some English citizen, of course, these are the ones you get to know about, right? Because they're blared out in the newspaper, another form of propaganda. They're remodeling a house. Oh my gosh, we've come across a dozen shotguns. There's 3 Webley revolvers and 400 rounds of ammunition. Oh my gosh, what are we to do? Call the police right away. Don't touch anything. I mean, it's in a lot of American households, I think, whoa, is this cool?
Yeah.
Of course, we don't register them generally. We don't require guns to be registered, so it's a completely different situation. Just wrote an article about an Israeli family where they were remodeling a house, and they had a large cache. They had submachine guns. They had grenades. And the son was remodeling, found it, obviously.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Nice.
Glad to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
How you guys doing?
Doing well.
Good to see you. We're doing a podcast right now.
Yeah, you want to chime in? Yeah. Okay.
It's nice to see John Lott here. He's doing great work at the show.
For you.
Oh, he can sit over there. It's fine.
Sit over there.
We're talking about the importance of privacy to the right to keep and bear arms. And we
probably need a lawyer or somebody more than me.
We were talking about the one of the strategies is to claim that governments can control crime by controlling who has access to weapons. That's one of the first stages in sort of this strategy
this logical fantasy they try to
confiscate weapons.
Okay, well, I can talk about that.
And then secondarily, to claim to control access to weapons, governments have to know who has the weapons, right? So,
okay. Well, I mean, I can talk about the aspect. I mean, you can look at places around the world that have banned all guns or all handguns, and every single time
that's a microphone.
that they've done that.
I'll clip it to your. There you go.
They've murder rates have gone up, so they haven't. I mean, you primarily end up just reducing the gun ownership by law-abiding citizens, not the criminals.
Yeah.
Have you come across any cases where gun registration is correlated with crime reduction?
Well, gun registration doesn't help you solve crimes, at least I can say that much.
Yeah, that's
And
my
so,
understanding.
I mean, obviously this is pretty obvious stuff, but in theory, if a gun is left at a crime scene and is registered to the criminal, then you can go and trace it back to the criminal. The problem is crime guns are almost never left at the crime scene. And the few times that they are left at the crime scene, it's because the criminal's been killed or seriously wounded. And the few times beyond that they're left there, they're not registered to anybody. And the once or twice they are registered to somebody, they're not registered to the person that committed the crime.
Exactly.
And obviously you can look at the data on that. Hawaii has had registration licensing since 1960. They had, I testified in legislature a while ago where the Honolulu police chief was on the other side, and he said he couldn't find any cases that they had been able to solve as a result of licensing and registration. But he was able to say that it took about 50,000 hours worth of police time each year to go and run the program. So that's 50,000 hours that we could have used for kind of real crime fighting stuff that works. But there are obviously, I mean, I'm sure you guys know all this stuff about all the other places around the country that have had registration and licensing. Chicago, D.C., New York, Maryland. New York and Maryland had also ballistic fingerprinting for 15 years. New York spent $45 million on it. And Maryland, I don't know how many millions of dollars, tens of millions they spent. But, even those two heavily gun control states dropped it after a while because even they realized that they hadn't solved one single crime as a result of it. And so, I mean, the gun control people said you needed more time. 15 years wasn't long enough to be able to start solving crimes. But so anyway.
If you would talk a little bit about, I've heard you say this before.
We'll go in a second, but
Sure. Yeah. One last point, if you don't mind, to make it about Australia. What happened there before the gun confiscation and after the gun in terms of the crime trends?
Sure. I mean, I've written on this a lot of times, but basically, if you look at firearm homicides and firearm suicides, they were falling for the 15 years prior to the buyback that was there. The buyback basically reduced the gun stock there by about, 28% or so. But the thing is, imagine you had a perfectly straight line that was falling over the whole period. You could pick any point along that line, the after average is going to be below the before average. What you want to do is to say, I mean, if I had a law that changed and was falling at the same rate before and after, I'd say it didn't have any effect, even though the after average is below the before average. What you want to do, does it fall at a faster or a slower rate, or is there some type of discontinuity that occurs in the line there? When you look at firearm homicides, what you find is that it actually stopped falling for about 8 years. So what happens with all the discussions there is they say, well, the after average is below the before average, but that's just because it was falling for the 15 years beforehand, so it was relatively higher beforehand. But if you look at suicides, total suicides actually rose after that, but they had a similar type of pattern where it was falling before and then kind of fell at a very slow rate afterwards.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know, this is John Lott. John Lott, of course, is the man behind the Crime Prevention Research Center. He wrote More Guns, Less Crime, Gun Myths. What other books have you written like that?
I have 10 books.
10 books. You've been involved in the research in this area for many years, and I think are one of the more widely known sources for information about crime trends and the effect of registration and buybacks and these sorts of programs. So,
Okay. All right.
yeah.
Well, thanks.
All right. So thanks for stopping by.
Good
Thank
seeing
you.
you.
Pleasure. See you tomorrow.
All right.
What's happening tomorrow?
You're giving a seminar I'm going to attend.
Oh, okay.
All right, everybody. Well, so that was John Lott. He just happened to pop by the booth, and he perfectly supported Dean's theory here that privacy and registration, are
Yeah, John and I have known each other for a while.
ineffective.
And one of the things that we didn't talk about here is that one of the tricks the other side uses in order to try to get statistics that look like it's doing something is they will look at only firearms deaths. But if you're murdered with a gun or a hammer, it really doesn't matter. You're still dead. And so if you're looking at whether a particular gun law is effective or not, you have to look at the overall rate of homicide. Or if you're concerned about suicides, look at the overall rate of suicides. And as John mentioned, suicides in Australia actually went up a bit after the gun law was there, and particularly the number of single vehicle deaths went up significantly. So people were killing themselves in single vehicle car crashes, and the number of hangings, which are nearly as deadly, they're very close to being as deadly as shootings when you're committing suicide, went up significantly as well. So you have to look at the overall rate. I mean, the purpose of the gun law supposedly is to lower the crime rate, to lower the murder rate, theoretically lower the suicide rate, but there's no real good data that you lower the suicide rate. You might lower the number of people who commit suicide with guns, but so what if more people hang themselves or crash into concrete abutments in a single car accident?
Right.
And so that's a logical discontinuity the other side tries to do. They can say, well, look, the number of gun homicides went down in this month after this law. And I'd say, so what? What was the overall rate?
Yeah. And I want to finish up because I know you're short on time as well. I want to finish up with a few thoughts on this last point again that you laid out in this strategy that gradually teach future generations that having weapons is bad. We talked a little bit about England and Europe, but what comes to mind, because we started the conversation with that the right to keep and bear arms is about protecting an individual right, but it's also about protecting the population against a tyrannical government.
Correct.
Right. And the thing that comes to mind almost immediately is the invasion of Ukraine. Right. And all of a sudden, a lot more Europeans are interested in the right to keep and bear arms.
Yeah, you're seeing that. There's a bit of a trend there.
Yes.
Something that should be encouraged, I believe.
Right. And I think it is in Poland, for instance. They've started
the
teaching.
Czech Republic, too,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So Italy, interestingly enough, is bumping up their self-defense laws a bit.
Yeah, so this propaganda over many years, I think, has changed the culture there around guns. But then when they're faced with a real threat, then they realize the value of that right.
And I think that the Eastern Europeans are more open to the idea that you need to arm yourselves against a tyrannical government because it wasn't that long ago, 20, 30 years, 35 years ago, that they were under a tyrannical regime. And I've talked to a couple of Eastern Europeans who've immigrated to the U.S., and they said for them particularly, it wasn't until they got here and start being exposed to the gun culture and encountered ideas they'd never even thought about, that it was so denigrated. The government is God, essentially, they were taught. And we still have that bifurcation here in the U.S., where there are the people mostly on the far left, I would say, where the government should be given all power because they can do all these wonderful things, and they'll never harm you because they're the government. And everybody knows the government is always good. So have you never read any history? Well, I guess not.
Yeah, exactly. They say it could never happen here too. That's another common thing.
Yeah, well,
like we're separated by two oceans from these governments, from Russia, from China, from these supposed threats.
And there are plenty of instances, even within the last few years, where government agents have killed people for the wrong reasons.
Yeah,
I did a whole series of stories about some bad cops in Houston that raided a house on bad information. They falsified a search warrant. They said they had contacted people and observed things, which they hadn't done, And they'd gotten away with getting these no-knock raid search warrants for so long without ever a problem that when they ran into somebody who was innocent and more prepared, a couple officers were wounded and this innocent couple was gunned down and their dog killed. But because the officer who I believe, he's up for trial now, so we can't say 100%, okay, orchestrated most of it, was wounded in the neck and the throat with a bullet from someone. We don't know for sure it was the .357 Magnum wielded by the husband. He couldn't communicate very well, and he's in the hospital. And so it is my opinion that he was prevented from effectuating a good cover-up.
Yeah.
And so they could trace his phone conversations, digital messages and everything, and his associates, and they found drugs that could have been planted and a gun that wasn't traceable in his car, which he wasn't supposed to have. All these things that he could have used to set up a cover-up situation.
Yeah.
But it all fell apart.
Yeah.
Plus, he had an unsympathetic prosecutor in Houston at the time. So,
well,
that happens.
It does. It does. And Dean, I know you've got to get out of here to get your stuff by 6 because the room gets locked up. That's right. So I really appreciate you stopping by to chat about this. I think it's something that people largely take for granted because people say, well, I've got nothing to hide. Why do I care about privacy? Right. And I think that you've given some people some food for thought here, at least as it relates to the right to keep and bear arms. Yes. But I think even more broadly.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Pleasure to be on.
Yeah. Thank you.